So while I was at the school, there was the first week of cleanout week where I had been thrown to the ground by Mr. Lairden. He had sat on my chest and began to try to cast a demon out of me. At the time, I believed it to be a homosexual demon. At that time, I had lost my breath during this session of exorcism that was in front of all the other students during this cleanout week session. And because I had lost my breath, Roberts Lairden eventually got up off of me. And having been in that charismatic world, one of the ways that you would declare that you were free is by shouting and by dancing and being exuberant. And so I remember after this session of quote unquote deliverance, getting up off the floor, being in a stupor. I was dazed, I was confused, I had just been assaulted.
Jonathan Sawyer, thanks so much for coming on to Talk Beliefs all the way from Colorado, USA. You are a Ph.D. candidate at the University of Colorado, researching and speaking out about religious and political extremism and its effect on schools and education. These concerns come from spending your formative years in a school associated with the New Apostolic Reformation, a movement that focuses on what it calls spiritual warfare. Great to see you, Jonathan. We recently heard you on the Indoctrination podcast with host Rachel Bernstein, a former Talk Beliefs guest. What with that and your recently published paper, it must be gratifying to finally be able to bring your research to the world.
It is. Thank you, Mark, for having me. I was recently speaking with Rachel Bernstein on the Indoctrination podcast. I've been on there a couple of times. I've also recently spoken with Dr. Steve Hassan, a world-renowned cult expert, as well as having been on the William Branham Historical Research podcast, which delves into the shadow sides of the history of Pentecostalism in the United States. I've also had the good fortune of publishing a bit recently, both in an academic article, but as well on a publication called Religion Dispatches, where I talk a bit more about my experience with a school associated with the very early years of the New Apostolic Reformation.
Today, we'll be talking about not only your own experiences in cult-like Christian schools, but also your research into how these groups infiltrate the education system. Jonathan, would you say that religious indoctrination was always part of your life?
Had a bit of a different childhood in the sense of not raised strictly in religion. I had my feet in both worlds, if you will. My parents divorced at a very young age after having moved to the southwestern United States in the state of New Mexico. And at the time, when people go through divorces, there is pain that surfaces and people look for ways to make sense of the pain. And one of the ways that my father did that is through becoming a born-again Christian of the Pentecostal, tongue-talking, faith-healing, demon-exorcising variety. And so from about the age of 5 years old onward, I was very influenced by my father's brand of Pentecostalism, which spanned various churches that were associated both with the Pentecostal movement as well as the independent charismatic movement, churches like the International Church of the Foursquare Gospel, churches that were associated with the prosperity gospel-oriented Word of Faith movement. And from as early as 8 or 9 years old, through my father's influence, I was being taken to crusades of people like Benny Hinn, who was a very popular faith healer in the 1990s. And he was very flashy and wore a white suit and had wavy hair and would get on the stage and have people in wheelchairs come up, and he would have this hypnotic music playing, and people would be quote unquote slain in the spirit, where somebody is supposedly so overcome by what they would believe is the spirit's influence in a meeting that people would fall over. And at 9 years old, I went to one of these meetings and actually experienced being slain in the spirit at a Benny Hinn crusade. But also from a young age, I was influenced by a gentleman who was ascendant in the charismatic and Pentecostal world who was named Roberts Liardon. And the Liardon focused more on this aspect of fighting the devil and warfare forms of Christianity. And I knew of Liardon from as early as 8 or 9 as well. But not only did he have this warfare side of his ministry, but he also wrote books that made him popular. A book called I Saw Heaven, where he claimed at the age of 8 years old to have been taken up to heaven and having walked on golden streets and having had a water fight with Jesus Christ in the river of life. And so there were all these fantastical stories that I heard about from Mr. Liardon from a young age. And around the age of 16 or 17, I had learned about a Bible school that Roberts Liardon had created and oversaw in the state of California. Now, as I mentioned earlier, I had also a set of parents who were more progressive, who were not religious in the sense that I'm speaking about here. And through their influence, I had earned a scholarship to study music, a scholarship that would pay for my entire university education. And but around that time, I became more and more indoctrinated into Roberts Liardon's version of Christianity, this warfare version of Christianity. And I had made the decision secretly through collaboration with my father and his influences to go to Roberts Liardon's school. This was a big source of tension for my other set of parents, for teachers and friends in my life who could not understand how I was being so swayed by this extremist form of Christianity with language of demons and warfare and conquering. But I made the decision to do that. And unbeknownst to my more progressive oriented parents, literally in the middle of the night, I was whisked away and flew to Southern California, where Liardon had his Bible college. And I called my other set of parents and said, I'm not going to university. I have made the decision to pursue the high calling of God, and found myself in this school that was associated with the very early years of the New Apostolic Reformation networks.
So you found yourself in the school associated with the New Apostolic Reformation. Jonathan, what are the beliefs of the NAR, and what was life like for you while attending this school?
The New Apostolic Reformation is not a movement that you would be able to Google and find a church that is quote unquote NAR. Really, it is more of a set of leadership networks that influence millions of people in the United States and throughout the world. And there are some distinctive marks of these leadership networks. Before I talk about those, I want to discuss how the NAR came to fruition. In the 90s, there was a professor of church growth at Fuller Theological Seminary. His name was C. Peter Wagner. And he was raised a Congregationalist, which is not known to be the extreme forms of Christianity, but he had become enthralled with the charismatic and Pentecostal movement and believed that this movement was on the cutting edge of Christianity and believed that it would be the dominant force in the years to come, and also believed that it would be the churches that were instrumental in ushering in the second coming of Jesus Christ. And so Wagner began to astutely network with leaders, primarily pastors of megachurches throughout the United States and the world that he believed were endowed with this special Pentecostal power. And he began to name these churches and these organizations as part of what he called the New Apostolic Reformation. And he called this the greatest move of God since the Protestant Reformation many centuries ago. And so these individuals began to join together and began to see themselves and to be seen by their followers as prophets and apostles. And these prophets and apostles were ones who were infused in these charismatic and Pentecostal churches. And these apostles were believed to have governing authority, this top-down authority, not only over their members, but as this NAR movement would grow, the doctrine turned into and developed into this idea of not only dominating churches and ruling over your members, but also ruling over these various spheres of society. And this school that I was a part of, again, led by this gentleman named Robert Slayerden, was one of the first, if not the first, that was named as part of these New Apostolic Reformation networks. Layerden himself was deemed an apostle through these networks. And at this school, as I had mentioned earlier, I had cut off ties with family. I had essentially been whisked away to this school and had decided that these worldly ideas and these worldly pursuits were not worth pursuing myself. And instead, I needed to devote myself to this school, to this movement, to this leader. And as I was in this school, there were very authoritarian dynamics at play. We had things like the first week of school was called clean out week. And in that week, students would be joined together in these almost hysterical moments of mass worship that we believed to be piercing the heavens. And not only were we in these mass hypnotic forms of worship, but we were also primed to believe that during this clean out week, and the reason it was called clean out week is because we had been taught that coming to the school, we had demons within us. And so this week was set aside for us to pray, to be in what the Pentecostals would call intercession, and to ultimately be cleansed of these evil spirits that we believed were within us. And that first week of school at Spirit Life Bible College, I was in this hypnotic trance, pleading with the Lord to be what I believed to be a demon of homosexuality. Now, at that time in my life, I had experienced adolescent, what I would have called same-sex attraction. And that was a defining part of what I was seeking to be free from at this school. So the New Apostolic Reformation was composed of these leadership networks, but there are really three defining aspects of the New Apostolic Reformation that exist today that had its foundation at the school I was a part of. One would be this idea that there are prophets and apostles, prophets having the ability to discern the very thoughts and intents of the mind, to be able to look into the future, to be able to offer not only predictions about what might happen politically in the geopolitical spheres, but also bringing words of what they would call knowledge to individuals to help them in their path and to help those individuals decide what choices to make in their lives. But then there were these apostles who were leading not only over the churches and ruling over the churches, but also ruling over governmental spheres of society. There was another aspect of the New Apostolic Reformation, which is important to note, which is this idea of spiritual warfare. Not only spiritual warfare within, so for example, somebody like me who at that time in my life had physical and emotional attractions to other adolescent boys, but also spiritual warfare in what they were believed to be the heavenlies. And so there was this idea that there were territorial spirits ruling over regions that would influence people for nefarious ends. And that is a distinctive part of the New Apostolic Reformation. And then the third part of this, which I alluded to earlier, is this idea of dominionism and ruling over not only the flock and the church, but also ruling over society.
The school was not at all sympathetic to the LGBT community, as you said, and certainly not to any gay students within its ranks. You were a student wrestling with your own identity, but at the same time, towed the line of the school's rigid anti-gay stance. So, how did the school react to your sexuality, and what was the effect on you?
So when I had decided to apply to this school, one of the reasons, not the only reason, but one of them is I was really tormented about my physical and emotional attraction, not exclusively, but to some other boys at that time in my teenage years. And having been raised in the charismatic and the Pentecostal tradition, homosexuality was akin to, and I'm not being hyperbolic, things like murder. It was a very grievous, quote unquote, sin that from as early as 4 or 5 years old, when I had first been um, introduced into this world, I had heard horrific stories about the AIDS um, epidemic being a result of the quote unquote gay lifestyle.
A mystery disease known as the gay plague has become an epidemic unprecedented in the history of American medicine.
I had been taught from a young age that the source of quote unquote homosexuality was through demonic influence. I had been, even prior to going to this school, taken to an elder of the Foursquare Church that I was a part of in my adolescence, and had been subjected to a quite traumatic session of what they would have called deliverance prayer, which is a form of exorcism where the old man who was an elder of this church had me in the room with my father attempting to exorcise a spirit of homosexuality out of me. And so this was all a very pronounced and hidden part of my adolescence, something that I didn't discuss with my more progressive set of parents. And so as I went to this school, Roberts Lairdon, who ran this school, and by the way, this was a megachurch at the time, around 2,000 people. The school was maybe around 250 to 300 students. But Lairdon had written a book that I had read as a child called Haunted Houses, Ghosts, and Demons. And in this book, he had described this notion of homosexual demons. He had written in his book that he could smell foul spirits. I had listened to sermons of him where he would say that he would smell homosexuality on people. Now, of course, this was all framed in a way where he would then uh, assert the power to draw on the heavens and quote unquote deliver these people from homosexuality. But this was the environment that I had been primed for. So even before I had gone to the school, I had been immersed in this worldview, immersed in this sensational way of thinking about a very fundamental aspect of my humanity. So while I was at the school, there was the first week of cleanout week where I had been thrown to the ground by Mr. Lairdon. He had sat on my chest and began to try to cast a demon out of me. At the time, I believed it to be a homosexual demon. At that time, I had lost my breath during this session of exorcism that was in front of all the other students during this cleanout week session. And because I had lost my breath, Roberts Lairdon eventually got up off of me. And having been in that charismatic world, one of the ways that you would declare that you were free is by shouting and by dancing and being exuberant. And so I remember after this session of quote unquote deliverance, getting up off the floor, being in a stupor. I was dazed, I was confused. I had just been assaulted physically and emotionally. And I began to gyrate and dance, dance like David danced before the Lord, with people shouting. And then even a few days later, had people come to me and say, "Oh, brother, we saw your deliverance. We're, so happy for you." But what they didn't know is that that day, walking home from that session of deliverance, I was out of my body. I remember walking home and feeling so alone and feeling so confused about that experience. And over the next 2 years, I had been subjected to a number of these quote unquote deliverance sessions. None is quite as dramatic as the one that I had experienced when the apostle was on my chest trying to cast out a demon, but still traumatic enough that I remember them. But there was also this way that the apostle of this church proclaimed that if the Spirit didn't work, you could also look into other forms of help that the Pentecostal community may have looked down upon, like therapy. And so you hear that and you go, wow, that's great. So the inside I'm thinking, I wasn't delivered from this demon of homosexuality. I'm still finding myself occasionally attracted to other male students in the school. And so the preacher, out of the quote unquote generosity of his heart, decided to pay for me to go to therapy. Well, unbeknownst to me until later, this gentleman who he sent me to was a conversion therapist who was working me through months of trying to figure out all of the reasons that I was quote unquote homosexual through, having a controlling mother and an absent father. That was one of these tropes. Through trying to delve into every little intimate part of my childhood to find that one area where somehow the homosexual tendencies had started to grow, almost as if it was a disease. And that, coupled with these really fantastical experiences of deliverance, was a lot for me to process over the next few years. But I should say that the catalyst for me eventually getting out of this was toward the end of my association with Robert Slerdon and his school. There was a scandal that rocked the church and rocked the school, and that's not uncommon in these worlds that are very celebrity driven. But Lairdon himself had been in a homosexual relationship with a youth pastor. And there were some really disturbing allegations and things that came forward about the psychological abuse and manipulation that was happening. And the stark hypocrisy of that moment began to wake me up, but it took a long time.
Jonathan, what led you to finally leave this world behind?
So that moment of revelation regarding the apostle Robert Slerdon, quote unquote apostle, and the juxtaposition between the incredibly fierce anti-gay, anti-lesbian, anti-anything that wasn't perceived as normal environment of the school, with Mr. Lairdon himself being in a relationship with another man, was something that just short-circuited my brain and my heart. It was so difficult to come to terms with this disparity of what I had been hearing in the church, what I had been believing, what I had even subjected myself to, and what was actually happening. I want to make a quick side note that Lairdon himself, we can get into these moments where we say, look at the big, bad, hypocritic preacher. But Lairdon himself, I know, had been subjected to deliverance prayers as a child, and had been subjected to men such as a gentleman named Lester Summerall, who made fame in the Philippines through having exorcised a demon back in I think it was the 50s or 60s. But I say that not to excuse the harm and the psychological and physical assaults that I experienced, but to bring context to this paradigm of the person who is victimized often becoming the one who victimizes others. Sadly, Lairdon today is still making particularly hostile statements about the LGBTQ community, particularly focusing on the transgender community. But after leaving his school, you don't just, it's not like a born again experience, at least for me, where I wake up and I've seen the light. There were moments of unfolding. I had, as many people do, saw the root of the rottenness of what I experienced there is inherent in the leader. And I don't think that's necessarily true. I think there are larger dynamics at play socially. And so people often go from one situation, such as I was in, with a leader who is exposed to some scandal, and then they'll find themselves in another very similar one. And so I jumped into another church that was part of these early NAR networks. Now, at the time, I didn't even know that they were aligned through these amorphous New Apostolic Reformation networks, but there was a similar vibe, a similar preaching about spirits, both within and without, similar practices of exorcism and of these ecstatic forms of worship and speaking in tongues and faith healing. But I had also suffered psychologically through my experience at the school and began to deal with major depression and major anxiety. And the only way I knew at the time to address that was through religion. And so I then found my way to a church that was less Pentecostal, less charismatic, more of a what would have been called back in the day a seeker-sensitive church, where it was almost like you would go to church and have a motivational sermon instead of these outlandish forms of preaching. And then I found my way to another church that was more doctrinally aligned, or what they would say more doctrinally sound. And this church had actually been part of the charismatic and Pentecostal movement, and then they had embraced Calvinism. And so they were joining together both this very doctrinal forms of like predestination and Calvinism, but also they had these charismatic roots. And so you'd go to church and it would remind me of being at Lairdon's church, because people are raising their hands, some people are crying, people are even on the ground worshiping the Lord, but then during the sermon you're hearing about the 5 points of Calvinism. And this church, though, was also, and I didn't know until recently, but some of the early leaders of this movement, which was called Sovereign Grace churches, had associations with some of these new Apostolic Reformation people and some of these early apostles. So it's no wonder that I found myself in these similar environments. And also a common theme in these environments was authoritarianism, was this top-down approach, this what they would call discipling, where you would subject yourself to the authority of the preacher. And that ran through my experience at Lairdon's church. It ran through my experience in this quote-unquote Reformed charismatic church. And I was still at the time desperately seeking freedom from what I believed to be something that was so abhorrent about myself, in particular my attraction to other men. And so at this Sovereign Grace Ministries churches, I had been counseled that the way to find healing is to find a woman to marry. And so we had these courtship rituals where you'd actually approach the dad and ask the dad if you could, begin to court the daughter. So a very, very possessive way of relationships, very transactional way of relationships. All of that over the span of about 10 years, from the time I had left Lairdon's to the time I found myself in this more authoritarian, doctrinal, neo-charismatic Calvinist group. And I hit my wit's end. I hit the lowest part in my life that I've ever experienced, emotionally, physically, and elsewise. And so in those moments, sometimes people kill themselves. I didn't do that. Gratefully, I found the support of skilled, compassionate, real therapists. I found the support of family and friends who cared for me along the way. And over the span of the next 10 years, began to really unpack many of the things we've spoken about during this interview, and finished my undergraduate degree at the age of 38, and got my master's degree at the age of 40, and am pretty close to being a doctor, a real doctor, not a doctor like some of these Pentecostal ministers claim to be. But that's a little bit about my story and how I got out.
Well, these early years of your life affected you in many ways, and today you devote your time to studying the ways America's Christian groups infiltrate and influence public education as well as politics and political groups. And much of this centers around something called Dominionism. Isn't that right?
Yes, yes. I alluded to the top-down orientation, the authoritarian ruling over not only congregations but also spheres of civil society earlier through my influence in this uh, school associated with NAR. But those ideas that I was subjected to in my adolescence have grown and over the years have exerted surprising and concerning to me influence over politics in the United States, particularly GOP politics. Dominionism, in the way that the NAR takes it up, is now taught as Christians being called to take dominion over 7 spheres of influence, what they now call mountains of influence. Now, these mountains of influence are family, religion, education, media, arts, and the government. I want to back up here, though, and say that this conquest-oriented way of approaching faith for the NAR believers and Pentecostals and charismatics that are influenced and others by the NAR has not always been at the forefront. When I was a child in the charismatic and Pentecostal traditions, I was scared out of my mind about the rapture being right around the corner. I didn't think I would live to be 20 years old because Jesus would be coming back soon. I had heard stories about the Antichrist and the false prophet and all of these integrations with politics in the Middle East that were signs of the imminent return of Christ, where those who had not accepted Jesus and were left behind would be either forced to renounce their faith or if they didn't renounce their faith, had their heads chopped off, right? So these were the types of things that I was exposed to. Well, now, the charismatic and Pentecostal tradition, not everyone involved in these groups, but especially those who are influenced by the NAR teachings, have shifted this idea of the end times and shifted this idea of being a victim of the secular culture and having Jesus come back to rescue you from it all, to now saying, actually, we're the ones that should be in control. And we're the ones who will exert our control over these spheres of influence. And this will then lead to, maybe in 200 years, maybe in 1,000 years, maybe in 2,000 years, to the return of Christ. And so, what is troubling about this integration of charismatic authoritarianism with this dominionist way of approaching the world is you now have people that are bona fide individuals, part of these new Apostolic Reformation networks that are believed to be apostles, like a gentleman named Lance Wallnau.
We've seen the prophets, we've seen the apostles, but now God is restoring the apostle foundation in the church with the right sound and governing disposition. Amen. So that the prophets can be activated in the proper way, because God's building a house, an ecclesia that can occupy the tops of the mountains where the gates of hell are located.
And others who are in the orbit of powerful politicians. And this came into prominence, particularly in the early Trump administration in 2016, where Trump appointed his spiritual advisor as Paula White, who is a Pentecostal, who claims to be an apostle, who comes out of these same traditions that I've discussed throughout this interview, who believes in demons and being freed from demons. And if you get those kind of people in power, in the type of power that can influence policy to such a great degree, I have strong concerns, particularly for the anti-LGBTQ strains of this movement and how this movement will influence various spheres of society, including schools. And that's what I spend my work doing. In fact, in the state of Oklahoma, Ryan Walters, who's had some controversy of late, has said the Bible needs to be in schools. We need to teach from the Bible, even in science classrooms. Every classroom should have a Bible. And he's saying this in a way that for some might excuse his language as well. He's just introducing this very fundamental text of Western civilization. But Ryan Walters was at a new Apostolic Reformation event called City Elders in the state of Oklahoma being prayed over. And we know that he's consulted with some of these Dominionist people. We know that he has been integrated and learning from and backed by groups like the Heritage Foundation, which is a prominent right-wing think tank in the United States. So this isn't all about just pluralism in religion and allowing students to know about the Bible as the historical text. That's already allowed. This is about bringing in an extremist form of Christianity that, in my view, departs from some of the best parts of Christianity that I remember, which is reaching out to the least of these, reaching out to the marginalized, being one who cares for those, the widows and the orphans that are in need, and instead says, we're to conquer the world. We're to not only conquer you, bad LGBTQ person who's infested with demons, but we're also supposed to conquer society and implement policies that fundamentally remove your rights. And that's a real concern when you integrate Dominionism as it exists today with GOP politics.
You've published a peer-reviewed paper entitled Unhidden from Self on LGBTQ Students and the Conspiratorial Demonology of the New Apostolic Reformation. Jonathan, what does this paper cover, and how has it been received?
Yeah, as an academic, I started this paper as a very dry policy and law-oriented article where I was looking at the influence of public funding of religious schools, and I was thinking about more extremist religious schools. But as you go throughout the peer review process, you get feedback about ways to develop your paper. And surprisingly, unsettlingly perhaps, but also inspiringly in a way, I had received feedback to bring in some personal narratives to the paper and to infuse that with my academic work, my theoretical work, and my policy work. And so the paper is not something you would probably see in your regular academic journal, because I start out right at the bat talking about my experiences at the school associated with the New Apostolic Reformation. I weave throughout my experience or throughout the paper, my experience in the schools with exorcism and deliverance prayers and conversion therapy, and I'll also talk about the type of curriculum that we were exposed to, the very Christian nationalist oriented curriculum. And then I also engage with a mid-20th century thinker who was named Frantz Fanon, who wrote about the experiences of individuals in the Caribbean territories that were colonized. And there were individuals that Fanon worked with who, through the conditions of colonization, were Black Caribbeans that did not conceive of themselves as Black. So whenever there was the idea, or it was brought before them, that they were Black, they would say, no, that's not me, that's those other people. And usually in a way that was denigrating individuals who were originating from Africa. And I'm very careful in the paper that I can't draw direct parallels between the experiences of racism and race and the psychological ways that somebody responds to rhetoric that demonizes them and dehumanizes them. But Fanon, in his book called Black Skin, White Masks, is very clear that he is talking about humanity in this book. He's not just talking about color of skin. He's talking about the psychological mechanisms of how people are influenced by oppressive ideas and systems and ways of being, and shows the ways that people can almost be detached and removed from a fundamental part of who they are. And so I take that idea and I build on it, and I discuss what I call this concept of self-invisibility, where I reflect upon my own experiences and then think about students that are in schools like I was in, who may have physical and emotional attractions to a person of the same gender, for example, but are so subjected to this harmful discourse about certain people groups, that they disconnect from others, are harmed by that themselves psychologically and physiologically sometimes, but also then perpetuate that harm onto others. And so I draw that all together to say we need to think about public money going into extremist schools like the school that I attended, because the roots of democratic instability and authoritarianism don't just come out of the blue. They find their origins in how people are raised. And schools are a fundamental part of how people are indoctrinated into these authoritarian ideas. So that's a bit about the paper. As far as feedback, pushback on the paper, I have heard some say, well, this does not represent, your typical charismatic and your typical Pentecostal. This does not represent the experiences of all individuals who are part of groups influenced by the NAR. And I think that's fair criticism. But what I would say is this was my experience. And I've talked to enough people to know that this is the experience of others. And so there needs to be a light shined upon these harmful doctrines and practices that affect people both individually, but also have democratic implications.
It's very important work that you're doing, Jonathan. I just want to thank you for coming onto the show to share your research with us today. So what else have you got in the works? Any upcoming projects that you could talk about?
Sure. So I'm a Ph.D. candidate, which means I'm in the dissertation phase of my work toward receiving my PhD. And so I've got a lot of different projects, some of which are related to this that we've talked about. In particular, I'm thinking about benefits that religious organizations receive in the United States. So tax exemptions, exceptions from various laws, benefits as it pertains to zoning and how they can build their churches and residential neighborhoods and all of these things. And I'm thinking with my advisor through the implications of the Supreme Court having recently elevated this idea of religious freedom to almost being this untouchable conception where religious freedom is held up as an impenetrable defense to discrimination and other things. And so we're working through the legal and policy implications of that. I'm also working on a project that is related to democracy, which is the influence of artificial intelligence and technology and education, and what that means for a pluralistic democracy. And I'm, of course, working my way through ultimately conducting a study pertaining to various extreme forms of religion and their influence in education. Some of these projects will culminate in my dissertation in hopefully by the spring of 2026. As far as other things that I'm doing in public scholarship, I really will be turning my attention to my academic life over the next academic year, so until June, perhaps a little less present in public discourse because I'll be teaching a class on education and society in the United States. But I do have an event in Woodland Park, Colorado, for any listeners that are near Colorado Springs, where I'm interviewing an investigative journalist about a ministry called Andrew Womack Ministries and Charis Bible College, which is influenced by the New Apostolic Reformation. As part of these charismatic and Pentecostal networks, they're very influential in politics today, and I'll be interviewing this journalist about his work into some of the very troubling shadow sides of this ministry. And so if you're in the area, would love to see you there. You can find that information on my website, which is johnsawyer.org, JONSAWYER.org. And you can also follow me on the application formerly known as Twitter, otherwise known as X, at John Sawyer CO. Thank you.
Jonathan Sawyer, thank you very much indeed.
Thank you, Mark. It's a pleasure to be here. I've appreciated some of the other videos that I have seen you post. They've been so well done and quite interesting. And I hope some of what I've shared speaks to others, and would love to hear from anybody that wants to connect.